Hello, welcome to this video series on Theme B, Religion and Life. This is our first lesson in this video series and it's all about B1, Scientific Truth and Religious Truth. Our objectives today are to differentiate between those two, to understand the function of each and to evaluate the value of each as well. This is your need to know for today. Today you need to know that when it comes to scientific and religious truth, it's not an either-or relationship. They serve different functions and they are valuable in different ways. Let's jump on in. We're going to start with a question for you to ponder. Which of these tools do you think is the most important? The screwdriver or the hammer? We're going to come back to this question shortly, but have an answer in the back of your mind. Now, we're going to start by thinking about these two types of truth today, scientific truth and religious truth. And these are two quite helpful ideas that are going to take us forward through future lessons. So it's important to get a good grasp on them today. So starting with scientific truth. So scientific truth is all about coming up with hypotheses and theories. And a hypothesis is an assumption about how things work that you then try and prove using different observations. Good science involves repeated observations. So you see the same thing repeating over and over time, and you can come to a realization of truth about that thing. Great example would be the temperature that water boils. If you boil water and you measure the temperature, it's going to hit 100 degrees Celsius, and it's going to do that every single time you try and do it. So over repeated observation, you can see that that is a truth, and you've arrived at that truth through scientific means. That's what's meant by scientific truth. Science is all about the what and the how. What's this made of? How did this come to be? How does this work? The what and the how. It's also about function and it's about process. So what does this do and how does this do it? This is what science is all about. Now, scientific truth, it can be challenged and it can be tested. So a great example of this we'll look at next lesson is about the origins of the universe. So you probably are aware of the Big Bang Theory, and again we'll talk about this next time, but the Big Bang Theory replaced a theory that was already in place called the steady state theory. And all the time we're testing these theories out and we're making sure that we think they're definitely true. And who knows, there might be another theory waiting to come out that's going to replace the Big Bang Theory one day. There is a theory called the pulsating hypothesis theory, and maybe that's going to be the one that comes in which is persuasive enough to replace the Big Bang Theory as the key theory we think about when we think about the origins of the universe. The other thing about, and linked to that, about scientific truth is that it's conditional. It's not absolute. So it's conditional means that it's reliant on other things to make it so. So we come to a conclusion of scientific truth based on the conditions around it, the observations we've seen, and the testing that we have done. Well, what about religious truth? Well, so religious truth is truth that has come about through God, through divine means. When God divinely reveals his nature, the nature of the world, the nature of us to humans, that is religious truth. Now this has come about by loads of different ways depending on what your stance is and what religion you're looking at, but generally most religions would have something similar to a prophet, so a human who's been spoken to by God who then takes God's message to others, or holy books that have been inspired by God in some way, be that a literal writing down or a general inspiration, or by people who have experienced the divine in some capacity and have then moved on to tell the story of that. That's how religious truth is understood and how it's communicated to people. When it comes to religious truth, it's different to science. Scientific truth is about the how, whereas religious truth is about the why. Why are we here? Why does the universe exist? Is there a purpose to everything? These are the end goals, if you will, of searching for religious truth. Religious ideas, they're from scripture generally, they're from things that have been written down and recorded. And what changes, different to science, is that the words of those things, the message doesn't change. However, as we know, the interpretation can change, and different people can interpret the same thing in different ways. And because of its nature, generally religious truth is said to be absolute. It is unchanging, and it's relevant for all times. So for Jews, for example, the same text that they read today is the same text that their ancestors read thousands of years before. And many Jews would say that just like that text was relevant for thousands of years ago, it's also still relevant today. And it's about interpreting that truth for this context. So when we come to these two ideas, these ideas of scientific truth and religious truth, there's a few things you want to be able to do. You want to be able to differentiate between the two. So some examples of scientific truth, they might include the boiling temperature of water, the way that the planets move around the sun, whereas religious truth would be about what is the purpose of life, what is marriage, how should I treat other people, and rules to do with ethics. If you believe there is such a thing as intrinsic right and wrong. And again, maybe that's a discussion for another time. But these are some examples of them. Then we need to think about what is their purpose. So one's all about the how and the what, and one is about the why. When it comes to which one is more important, that's actually a bit of a naive question. That's like saying the question I started with at the beginning of this lesson, what's more important, a screwdriver or a hammer? Hopefully when you thought about that, you actually thought, well, if you're putting a screw in or taking a screw out, you want a screw, and if you're putting a nail into something, then you want a hammer. They're two different tools for two different purposes. And that's just like scientific truth and religious truth. I've worked with students before who say, I'm not really into religion, I'm more into science, and that ironically suggests a bit of ignorance to me as to what the purpose is of science and what the purpose is of religion, because they are very different. If we look back through history, you'll see that some of the great scientists were Christians, people like Copernicus and Galileo, Kepler, William Harvey and Isaac Newton. All of these people were Christians through history. But there's Christians today who are leaders in scientific research. Christians, just like Dr. Francis Collins here, you might have seen him on television recently as he's led the US program to find a vaccine for COVID-19. He's been in the news a lot over the past decade. He was famous for mapping the Human Genome Project. He's seen some amazing stuff done through science in the US over the past 10 and 20 years. He's a real interesting guy because he is a Christian. You can watch an interview with him on live where he talks about his Christian faith and experience of him at the bedside of a patient who thought they might die. And they had a discussion about God. And he found himself there by this patient's bedside in this moment going, do you know what? I've come to the conclusion about whether or not there is a God who exists without looking at any of the evidence. And scientists are supposed to be people who make conclusions based on evidence. So for him, he hadn't done that. When he looked into the evidence for the person of Jesus and even Jesus' resurrection, it led to his conversion. He says here you can see that one can come to belief on a rational basis. This journey that he thought would lead to strengthening his atheism actually led to his conversion to Christianity. He's a great example of a scientist who's also religious and sees no contradiction between those two disciplines when you're looking for truth in life. When we're looking at religious truth claims and scientific truth claims, a really important question to ask is, are these compatible or are they conflicting? I.e., can these work together all right, or are they at odds so much that one of them must be true and one of them must be false? A classic example of this would be the Big Bang Theory and evolution, and do they cancel out and contradict the teaching from the Bible? Great example we've just mentioned is Dr. Francis Collins, who's a scientist who has no problem believing in evolution, and he thinks it goes hand in hand with the Christian message. But we'll look at that a bit more in our next lesson. A great quote about science and religion comes from Sir William Bragg, who says, "From religion comes a man's purpose, from science his power to achieve it." Sometimes people ask if religion and science are not opposed to one another. They are, in the sense that the thumb and the fingers of my hand are opposed to one another. It is an opposition by means of which anything can be grasped. I.e., these are two different things with two different functions, and using them together is a way to grasp truth. Time to pause now and check your understanding. 4 questions and an extension. Pause the video, have a go. When you're ready, unpause it and we'll look at the answers. Okay, let's look at the answers now. So in your own words, explain what is meant by scientific truth. So scientific truth is truth that is arrived at by scientific means using experiments, repeated observations over time to prove a hypothesis or theory. Whereas religious truth is truth and reality that is revealed by God. And that might come through holy books, through prophets, or people who have experienced the divine. An example of scientific truth might be the temperature that water boils at. It might be how the planets rotate around the sun. An example of religious truth might be, what is the purpose of life? Is there a God? How should I treat other people? Examples of religious scientists might include Galileo, Copernicus, Isaac Newton, or Dr. Francis Collins. And this one's all about your opinion. Which type of truth, in your opinion, is more important than why? And hopefully you've given some good examples for that. And your extension there was to look up more about Dr. Francis Collins. Next lesson, as I said, we'll be looking at the origins of the universe and the origins of human life and thinking about whether or not they're compatible or conflicting. But that brings us to the end of this lesson. Hopefully you found that very helpful. Let's look now to our need to know one last time. Today you need to know that when it comes to scientific and religious truth, it's not an either-or relationship. They serve different functions and they're valuable in different ways. Thanks for tuning in. Looking forward to seeing you next time.